Okay. Okay, Shua Tov, everyone. We are delighted to welcome you to the Ner Yisrael and Raleigh Close Winter Series of Shirim, and we're particularly pleased Dayan Binstock is speaking to us tonight on Antibiotics and Immunity, a Jewish Perspective. Dayan Binstock is a Dayan at the London Basin, also Senior Rabbi at St. John's Wood Shul. He's actively involved in adult education and pastoral counseling. He's a principal of the Northwest London Jewish Day School and rabbinic advisor to the governors of Emmanuel College in Bushey. Before embarking on his rabbinical career, Dayan Binstock obtained a degree in chemistry at University College London and remained there to do postgraduate research before going on to yeshiva. We have a number of dedications. Shir sponsor Nishmas Pesa Bas Eliyahu Yitzchak, Mrs. Pessi Simmons, Zichrona Levracha, the mother of Sylvia Simmons, whose yahrzeit was the 5th of Teves. Mrs. Simmons, I understand, knew Dayan Binstock well, and they doubled many years ago in the same shul in Stamford Hill. And this is a fitting topic since Mrs. Simmons worked for 30 plus years in the pharmaceutical industry. She has also sponsored Lil Nishmas, the late Louise Sinclair, Leah Rochel Bas Natan Yaakov, Zichrona Levracha, to mark the 17th anniversary of her passing. Also dedicated Lil Nishmas Zvi Yehuda Halevi Ben Levi, Henry Miller, Zichrona Levracha, the father of Elaine Gold, whose yahrzeit is the 26th of Shavat. And last dedication also dedicated to Nishmas Avraham Ben Nachman, Zichrona Levracha, my father-in-law, whose yahrzeit was on Shabbos, 6th of Shavat. So I hand over to you now, Dayan Binstock, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, and thank you, Naomi, for inviting me to take part in your education program and to give this shiur. Can I mention one additional dedication, which it just emerged in the last few days, also to dedicate the shiur in memory of Lyra Winston, Alei Hashem, Lehinda Bas Yosef Shimon, a sister of Naomi Landy and Ruth Pollock, and the wife of Robert, and mother of Ben, Hadia, and Joel. She passed away a few weeks ago, and her shloshim was on Monday morning. Those of us who knew Lyra, she was a wonderful woman. She was warm, she was wise, she was passionate about education and family and community, and she could take the long view. And the last time Rachel and I, my wife Rachel and I, met her is that we'd been to the event at Spencer House in memory of Rabbi Lord Sachs, and Rachel and I left at the same time as Robert and Lyra. And Lyra knew exactly where to go. Spencer House is tucked away in St. James, and Lyra led us confidently up one narrow alley, down another narrow alley, until we emerged just by the tube station. And Lyra had a great sense of direction, and I mean that in a moral sense. She knew exactly where she was heading. She was the midwife to many key educational projects in the community. And as I say, I think this particular topic will be of particular interest to her. We're looking at her farsightedness in the community. And if Lyra was someone I'd got to know my student days onwards, the other dedication, which I'd like to, at the risk of being invidious, but someone I knew well, is to the association with Pessi Simmons, mother of Sylvia, who's one of my parents' closest friends, and as well as the as it were, pharmaceutical connections that Susan, you just mentioned as well. Pessi was someone that I knew well as a woman of great warmth and hospitality, a woman of great positivity despite her many challenges, a woman of great bitachon, and a woman of grounded common sense. And so, we read the day the Pasha's boy with an idea that that our ancestors were redeemed from Egypt in the merit of righteous women. And the Yalkut Shimoni says, and the future Geula Hashem will come also in the merit of righteous women. And so Lezachush should be as a chus for us, as well as the other dedications which we have in this year. So antibiotics, a Jewish perspective. Now, let's first make a general point. Looking after our health is a Jewish responsibility. The Rambam says that emphatically at the beginning of the 4th chapter of Hilchos Deis. Haguf bori v'sholim midarchi Hashemhu shari efshe shiyovin oyeda dovam yedias habayir b'hu choyle. לפיכך צורך להרחיק אדם עצמי לדבורים המעבדים את הגוף ולהנגיש עצמי לדבורים המברים והמחלימים. Since maintaining a healthy and sound body is among the ways of God, for one cannot understand or have any knowledge of the Creator if he or she is ill, Therefore, a person must avoid that which harms the body and accustom himself to that which is healthy and helps the body become stronger. And so, antibiotics. I was first drawn to this topic over 8 years ago. I'd read a book by the then chief medical officer, Dame Sally Davis, called The Drugs Don't Work. Sally, I found out, had deliberately chosen this title, knowing that it was also the title of a hit song by a rock band called The Verve. And though Sally and The Verve had different types of drugs in mind. And I've been engaged with the subject ever since. And if anything, the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the importance and urgency of this subject. Now, if I hope to achieve anything this evening, I'm not planning to give you a great lomdus in any way. I feel it's my achrayas. Some of you may know this all, and it's unnecessary, but I feel it's my achrayas to alert you from a general and Jewish point of view to the dangers of antimicrobial resistance and what we as individuals and as a community can do about it. So let me read the opening of Sally Davis's book to you. She says, "It's a dark July day. Mrs. Chi has not been counting, but it is the 15th day of her isolation. It started with a wheeze a week after her son's birthday. She'd taken Josh to the theme park with a couple of his school friends. She keeps on going back to that day in her mind. It was full of energy and laughter. The wheeze turned into a cough, the cough into a sore throat. Her husband, John, gave her that look, concerned but distant, scared of what was coming. He knew. It had happened to one of his colleagues at work. He was already thinking about what it would mean. How would he look after Josh? Would he cope? When Josh was born 16 years ago, the crisis was beginning to take hold. In the final months of her pregnancy, Mrs. Jew was advised to stay indoors, to segregate herself from friends and family. When Josh went to nursery, she and John were lectured by the head about how irresponsible it was to send a child into public even with mild symptoms. They were given a home testing kit. Josh had to spit on a strip of paper. If it turned green, he could attend. If it was red, he must stay at home. They called it the red spot. John's mum likened it to a pregnancy test. A few years later, shortly after Josh joined primary school, the government passed new laws, making it a criminal offence for the infected to be in public. There were talks of random tests in the street. If you were contagious, you would be committed to one of the isolation sanatoriums that were being built on the edge of all major towns. This was a death penalty. They're referred to as the Colonies. Mrs. Chu wants to die at home. She has spent 2 weeks in her room on her own. John and Josh leave her food and medication in the sealed space between the two doors. They use the outer door. She opens the inner door. She speaks to the doctor. He provides her with fever-reducing medicine, painkillers, and something to help at the end. He also notifies the authorities. Their home is now identified as an infection spot. The year is 2043. So Sally Davis writes this in 2013. And with our COVID experience now, nearly 2 years, it's eerily familiar to us about the possibilities that could happen. If we come into a scenario where antibiotics will cease to work, then what we've had a taste of in lockdown could be so seriously magnified that we'll be, in a sense, living as prisoners, chas v'shalom, in our own homes under certain, as it were, very, very worrying circumstances. I want to stress that what Sally Davis writes is not a piece of scaremongering from tabloids. Sally Davis was writing as the government's then chief medical officer, a respected and very experienced scientist and physician. And I think as Jews, we need to be informed and alert to what is one of the urgent issues of our time. When Jonathan Sachs, the late Zichrono Livracha, as chief rabbi, addressed the Lambeth Conference of Bishops in 2008, he developed a theme of the late Rabbi Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Rav Soloveitchik, in his work Kol V'Didufek, distinguishes what he called a Brit Goral and a Brit Yiyud, a covenant of fate and a covenant of faith. A covenant of faith is made by people who share dreams and aspirations, who have come together to commit themselves to something new. When we stood with our ancestors at Har Sinai was a classic example of a covenant of faith. A covenant of fate is when we share the same dangers, where we face a common enemy. When, whoever we are thrown together to face the dangers that lay ahead. The covenant of Noah was a classic example of a covenant of fate. The world had almost been destroyed by a flood. All of mankind, all life with the exception of Noah's Ark, had shared the same fate. Humanity after the flood was like the Jewish people after the Holocaust. The covenant of Noah was not a covenant of faith, it was a covenant of fate. And Hashem says, never will I again destroy the world, but I cannot promise that you will never destroy the world, because I've given you free will. All I can do is to teach you how not to destroy the world. And this is expressed very powerfully in the Midrash that Hashem says, makes these comments to Adam Rishon after creation. It says, the Torah Pasuk says, Hashem took the man and put him to Gan Eden to cultivate it and to guard it. And the Midrash says, B'shor shabar HaKadosh Baruch Hu es Adam Rishon natala b'echzira al kol ilonei Gan Eden v'amar lo re'ei ma'aseh kama noi mushibochim hei v'chol ma'aseh barosi b'shvilcha barosi. Ten da'atecha shelo tetkalke v'sachar ezoilomi she'im kilkalto eimi she'yetakin acharecha. So Hashem took Adam to see all the trees of the Gan Eden and say to him, look how pleasant my world is. And look at all the creations, how nice they are. Everything I created for you. And set your mind not to spoil them, not to destroy my world. For if you destroy it, there's no one to repair it after you. And so it is a covenant of fate that we face together with the rest of mankind regarding the future of antibiotics. Now let's set out the contours of the problem. I don't think anyone here on this Zoom shiur can remember a pre-antibiotic era, but it wasn't so long ago. I have here a book, a biography of Ramesh Shapiro of Lublin. And you read about how he met his end. He dies of a throat infection. He's there and he gets a sore throat. And it's Tuesday morning came, the Rab didn't appear for the early morning session. 5, 6, 7 o'clock, there was no sign of him. He was always there. And perhaps he overslept. They investigate. He said he has a sore throat. They call the doctors, and and as you know, the sore throat gets worse and worse, and eventually, after a few days, he dies of a sore throat. And reading this description, it's classic as an example of a strep throat, a throat infection that he had, which in those days, in 1933, was unable to be cured. And so he dies at the age of 46. Ironically, he paid off the yeshiva's debts with his life. When he founded his yeshiva in Lublin, he took out extensive loans, and the yeshiva was a benefactor of a life insurance policy he had taken out with Prudential. When the company had opened in Poland a few years previously, they'd offered him, a vigorous, healthy young man in excellent health, a sizable policy at excellent rates. And when he died in 1933, the equivalent of millions of dollars was paid out to the yeshiva. But the throat infection that carried away Ramesh Shapiro would be completely treatable with antibiotics a couple of decades later. But in those days, they were not yet available. And before the Second World War, infant mortality was high. My father, Oliver Sholem, had siblings who never reached adulthood. Many women died in childbirth. Some other statistics before antibiotics, 90% of children with bacterial meningitis died. And among those children who lived, most had severe and lasting disabilities from deafness to mental retardation. Strep throat was at times a fatal disease, and the ear infection sometimes spread from the ear to the brain, causing severe problems. Other serious infections, from tuberculosis to pneumonia to whooping cough, were caused by aggressive bacteria that reproduced with extraordinary speed and led to serious illness and sometimes death. But then down the road from where I live now in Maida Vale, at St. Mary's Hospital in Paddington, in 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. Fleming observed colonies of the common Staphylococcus aureus bacteria that had been worn down or killed by mold growing on the same plate or petri dish. It was an accident. He'd gone away on holiday and he came back and he saw how the mold had been killed. And he determined that this mold made a substance that could dissolve the bacteria. And he called the substance penicillin after the penicillium mold that made it. Now, Fleming hadn't appreciated the significance of what he discovered. He wrote it up, but left it there. And in 1938, Ernest Chain, who was Jewish, stumbled across Alexander Fleming's 1929 paper in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology, which he brought to the attention of his colleague, Florey. And during their research, Chain isolated and purified penicillin. And it was largely this work that earned Chain numerous honors and awards, member of the Royal Society, honorary degrees, Pasteur Medal, Paul Ehrlich Centenary Prize, etc. And further to their discoveries, Fleming, Chain, and Florey won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. And Chain in particular demonstrated the structure of penicillin and successfully isolated the active substance by freeze-drying the mold broth to make it use practical. When Chain was doing his research, he required 125 gallons of broth to produce enough penicillin powder for one tablet. And now the same tablet is mass-produced for just a few pennies. The Tiferes Yisrael, in his commentary to Pirkei Avos, he lists the Gentiles who are Hasidei Umas HaOlam for the discoveries they made in Perek Gimel. And he lists what he calls HaChasid Yena, the righteous Jenna, who discovered smallpox vaccine and we were rewarded in Olam Haba for having saved tens of thousands of lives. And the same can be said of Alexander Fleming, with, as a result of his discovery, so many millions of people's lives have been saved. And before long, other researchers in Europe and the United States started recreating Fleming's experiments. They began to make enough penicillin to begin testing it on animals and then humans. And starting in 1941, they found that even low levels of penicillin cured very serious infections and saved many lives. Drug companies were very interested in this discovery and started making penicillin for commercial purposes. And it was widely used for treating soldiers during the Second World War, curing battlefield wound infections and pneumonia. And by the mid to late 1940s, it became widely accessible for the general public. Newspapers' headlines hailed it as a miracle drug. Let's just see a few headlines of antibiotics over the decades. In 1943, Winston Churchill is cured by antibiotics. Churchill had been suffering from what could have been a fatal case of pneumonia, when Lord Moran and Brigadier Bradford saved him using the new antibiotic sulfapyridine. And in the same year, Albert Schatz and Selman Waxman isolated and developed streptomycin, a very effective drug against tuberculosis. But right from the start, Fleming could see that there could be a drawback in his discovery. In his 1945 Nobel lecture, he wrote, and let me quote, "The time may come when penicillin can be bought by anyone in the shops. Then there is the danger that the ignorant man may easily underdose himself, and by exposing his microbes to non-lethal quantities of the drug, make them resistant. Here is a hypothetical illustration. Mr. X has a sore throat. He buys some penicillin and gives himself not enough to kill the streptococci, but enough to educate them to resist penicillin. He then infects his wife. Mrs. X gets pneumonia and is treated with penicillin. But as the streptococci are now resistant to penicillin, the treatment fails. Mrs. X dies. Who is primarily responsible for Mrs. X's death? And that is in Alexander Fleming's Nobel lecture in 1945. Underdosage of an antibiotic creates resistance to it. Overdosage of an antibiotic creates resistance to it. Even the right amount of antibiotic used repeatedly will make it less efficacious. In fact, one of my friends, Professor David Sanders, who is a leading virologist and is also a member of St. John's Wood Shore as being a professor of virology in Indiana, says to me, antibiotics are bad for you. As well as tackling the disease, the antibiotics will kill other bacteria as well. There are 300 to 500 different kinds of bacteria living in your gut, comprising over 100 trillion bacteria, good and bad. A course of antibiotics clobbers all of them. In fact, as David Sanders says to me, there aren't side effects of antibiotics, they are just effects. It can take the body about 6 months to recover from a course of antibiotics. Someone I know well took a course for an infection in the arm, and some months on, he's living with an allergic reaction to gluten as a side effect of this antibiotic. So let's take a step back and continue the developments that have occurred since penicillin was discovered. In 1947, chloramphenicol was discovered by Ehrlich and his colleagues, a new class of antibiotic. In 1948, tetracycline is discovered, and global soil samples were analyzed by Benjamin Duggar, and he revealed the discovery of chlorotetracycline, a new class of antibiotic, and it proved itself by saving the life of a 5-year-old boy, Toby Hackett, even when other antibiotics had failed. This boy had surgery for appendicitis, and the wound became infected, and this was an experimental antibiotic only at that time. 1949, a new alternative is developed for people allergic to penicillin, erythromycin. In 1950, colistin is discovered by Koyama in Japan. It is the first polymyxin. It's a very powerful drug with common adverse reactions. It was replaced in the 1970s by less toxic drugs, but now antibiotic resistance has forced its revival. In 1952, a missionary sends soil samples from Borneo to his scientist friend, who leads to the discovery of vancomycin. In 1957, chemical modification becomes popular. Penicillin is made chemically, and rifamycin is made in the lab. The new drug can combat penicillin and streptomycin-resistant bacteria. In 1962, an accidental cure for gingivitis puts a new biotic, metronidazole, on the market. But meanwhile, another development is taking place, which I think is important to share with you. After the end of the Second World War, poultry production was increasing in the United States, and a new source of protein needed to be found. Farmers tried replacing fish meal with soybean meal, but soya lacked vitamin B12, which was essential for chicken growth. However, scientists working at the American company Ledell had recently discovered a new antibiotic, chlorotetracycline, and they knew that the bacteria producing the antibiotic also produced vitamin B12. So they decided to feed chickens on the waste product from the process to produce chlorotetracycline. And they saw that the chickens grew much faster than expected, and they soon realized this wasn't because of the vitamin B12, but because of the low dose of antibiotic that was still in the waste product. Within a few months, they started selling their product as a source of vitamin B12 for chickens, knowing full well that what they were really providing was vitamin B12 with an antibiotic growth promoter added. When in 1950 they revealed that their product actually contained chlorotetracycline, the US regulators just allowed them to continue selling it without any need for a veterinary prescription, because it seemed it was helping chickens and pigs to grow faster. The UK soon followed the US example. The 1947 Penicillin Act restricted access to antibiotics, making them own prescription-only drugs, both in human and veterinary medicine. And this was an early attempt to prevent the spread of antibiotic resistance, which was already known at the time. But by 1953, seduced by the thought of a post-war increase in meat production, the British government introduced a Therapeutic Substances Act, and despite the Act's reassuring name, it legalized the inclusion of very low doses of penicillin in the feed of pigs and poultry without the need for a veterinary prescription for the purposes of growth promotion. There was a debate in Parliament, and some concerns were raised about antibiotic resistance. But the Health Minister, Ian MacLeod MP, assured MPs that the government received expert advice. There will be no adverse effect whatever upon human beings. Just one MP, Colonel Com Duncan, spoke out strongly against growth promoters, asking, "May I ask whether we have not all gone mad to want to give penicillin to pigs to fatten them? Why not give them good food as God meant them to have?" But now, antibiotic use in farming began to develop. By the late 1950s, scientists were finding evidence that despite previous government assurances regarding the safety of growth promoters, antibiotic resistance bacteria could spread from farm animals to humans. They found that antibiotic resistant salmonella were proliferating on British farms due to antibiotic use, and that farm workers also had high levels of the same strain of bacteria. So the government decided to establish a committee to evaluate the existing regulations. It was chaired by the retired president of the Farmers Union, and it met behind closed doors. And although some members expressed concern about antibiotic resistance, those who emphasize the economic benefits of growth promoters won out. The committee published its report in 1962 and recommended that the use of growth promoters, which is up to then had only been legal in pigs and poultry, could be extended to be used in calves. However, around the same time, scientists were finding that the dangers of antibiotic resistance were spreading even faster than first thought. Scientists in Japan and then in the UK showed that the genes which made bacteria antibiotic resistant could spread between different bacteria and between different species of bacteria. By 1965, public pressure for greater restriction on farm antibiotic use was growing. And a series of studies led by Professor Anderson of the government's health laboratory identified a dramatic increase in human infections by multi-resistant Salmonella type 29. And this culminated in an outbreak in which some 6 people died. And Professor Anderson blamed not just the overuse of antibiotics, but the husbandry methods, saying infections such as caused by type 29 can be eliminated not by the massive use of antibiotics, but improvement of standards of animal husbandry. And he called for severe restrictions on farm antibiotic use. A few years later, a more extensive investigation was undertaken by the microbiologist Professor Michael Swan. The 1969 Swan report, as some of you might remember, recommended to the government that antibiotics be used in human medicine should not be used as growth promoters in animal production, and that a committee with the authority to review and recommend antibiotic use in animals, humans, and horticulture should be established. However, the recommendation was not robust enough, and many farmers were easily able to evade the regulations and use antibiotics in their farming for growth production. Sir Ernest Chain, one of the discoverers of penicillin, commented in 1970, "The Swan report has changed nothing essential. The farmer can get hold of exactly the same antibiotics as before, only it's more expensive because you need a vet's prescription. And of course, in all probability, more antibiotics will be used, and this is what I object to in this report. It is a hypocritical report because nothing essential is changed." And so we have this growth of the use of antibiotics in the farming industry with wonderful economic benefits because your animals are growing faster and they're growing bigger, but it is causing a problem of antibiotic resistance, which is being transferred from the food, from poultry and animals to humans. Back to the development of antibiotics themselves, lots of drugs are being discovered. In 1976, the pharmaceutical company Merck found a new class of beta-lactam antibiotics called carbapenems, which were able to kill bacteria that were resistant to other beta-lactams. And these are considered to be the drugs of last resort. But now resistant bacteria still emerged. And if carbapenems stop working, there'll be few alternative treatments left. In 1985, Sweden became the first country to regulate a ban on the use of antibiotic growth promoters in farm animals. They discovered that 30 tons per year of antibiotics were being used in their national food production, and consumer confidence in meat safety dropped and led to the first national regulated withdrawal of antibiotic growth promoters in food production. But meanwhile, there were many impacts that were being held in people in this country, America, etc. Just a few famous highlights, if you like. In 1990, the creator of the Muppets, anyone remember the Muppets? Jim Henson died from bacterial pneumonia. He had delayed going to hospital, and those few extra hours allowed the bacteria to spread so fast within him that he died from streptococcal toxic shock syndrome, despite being given a whole cocktail of antibiotics, and he was only 53. In 1994, Denmark banned routine preventative use of antibiotics in food animal production. And in 1997, the link between drug-resistant bacteria in animals and in humans becomes clear to the world. The WHO, the World Health Organization, held a meeting to discuss the use of antibiotics in animals. Lots of countries participated, some 70 countries from all human and animal health fields were invited to the meeting in Berlin to review the hazards that were associated with antibiotic use in production animals. And at the meeting, evidence was presented to show the transfer of antibiotic resistance from microbes in livestock production to humans through the food chain. And this was a point that was made very emphatically. 1998, WHO recognizes and suggests that prudent use should be made of fluoroquinones in food animals. In 2001, a new drug to treat MRSA reaches the market. Linezolid was introduced to the marketplace, and it's the first type of antibiotic that's often used to treat this MRSA. 2004, a famous UK actress, Leslie Ash, is admitted to hospital with broken ribs. She fell out of bed, unfortunately. And in hospital, she contracts MRSA, and they try with lots of drugs to treat her, and she's left paralyzed for months. She spends 10 years battling the infection with medication, eventually learning to walk again. She actually sued the NHS for negligence and received £5 million in damages. 2005, Georgie Best. Remember the footballer Georgie Best, who was taking immunosuppressive drugs for post-liver transplant, is admitted to hospital with flu-like symptoms. It turned out he had a kidney infection, and he spent the next 24 days in hospital battling while it spread throughout his body, no matter what the doctors did. They tried every antibiotic that they had, and finally he dies at age 59 of a lung infection and multiple organ failure. 2006, the EU bans all antibiotic growth promoters in food animals. Worries are being expressed that now we have left the EU, will the UK's laws on antibiotic regulation in animals be as robust as they were? America's rules are not as robust as the EU's, and it remains to be seen how the new legislation will pan out. 2006, a famous American football player, John Snow, he dies at the age of 62, and a run-of-the-mill sinus infection spreads at the site of an old hip replacement. He battles the infection for months before succumbing tragically to the bacteria and dies. 2013, the antibiotic resistance makes it onto the global risks register, and India changes its antibiotic regulation laws. The World Economic Forum Global Risks Report in 2013-2014 recognizes the magnitude of the global burden of antibiotic resistance and includes it on the Global Risks Register. In 2013, a Dutch TV star dies from E. coli infection. She goes to hospital thinking she has a standard bladder infection. They give her antibiotics. They don't work. The E. coli infection is treated to 7 of 8 by antibiotics, and eventually she's cured, but she almost dies. 2014, WHO publishes its first report on the global status of antimicrobial resistance, and a special prize is, and the UK sets up the Antimicrobial Resistance Commission. The UK Parliament in July of that year reported on the findings of the inquiry, and what we set up was called the Longitude Prize. The Longitude Prize is a prize worth £10 million by Nesta, the lottery-funded charity. And the idea is to set up an affordable, accurate, fast point of care test for bacterial infections, easy to use. All too often, the symptoms of an infection can either be either viral or bacterial. So to give you an example, when we were living in Israel at the beginning of our marriage some 40 years ago, if your kid had a sore throat and you went to the doctor, they didn't give you an antibiotic. They took a swab. And we said, well, our kid's got a sore throat. We need an antibiotic. No, we'll take a swab. And in a couple of days later, if the swab had produced a positive result for strep infection, then you were given the antibiotic. They didn't give you the antibiotic straight away, whereas our experience in the UK is that they just gave you an antibiotic very quickly. Now, it's very challenging, and what the Longitude Prize is trying to do is to encourage research to ensure that a test can easily be available at the doctor's level, at the GP level, to test whether do you have an antibiotic, do you have a bacterial infection, do you have a viral infection? If you've got a viral infection, take some painkillers and you'll be okay in a few days. It's only if you have the bacterial infection do you need the antibiotics. And if you take them and you don't need them, then you're spoiling yourself and spoiling others. David Cameron, the then UK Prime Minister, recognized the urgency and declared the need for urgent and global action. He's, as I say, set up this commission, a review on antimicrobial resistance. Another antibiotic in 2015, Teixobactin, is discovered, but still things are much more limited. And WHO releases a global action plan for antimicrobial resistance. And since 2015, the WHO has held a World Antimicrobial Awareness Week every year. Did you know about that? The last one took place in 2021 from the 18th to the 24th of November, which may well have passed you by. Their theme was spread awareness, stop resistance, but I think most of us, our heads were in our problems about COVID. We never really noticed what was going on. But it is something we need to educate ourselves about as much as we can and use the resources that are available. So having given you a sort of general medical background, let me just mention a few Jewish sources that give you, if you like, some a balance of Jewish ethics, if not presenting a systematic halachic approach. It's important to be able to take the long view. Who is the wise person? The person who can see the consequences of his action. And as we mentioned before, we mentioned the Rambam at the beginning, we have a mitzvah to look after our health. People often will cite the pasuk of Nishmatim l'oidel nafshoseichem, the pasuk of Eschanon, look after your health. Interpreting the pasuk in this way, interestingly, is quoted in a passage in Masechta Brachos as coming from the mouth of a non-Jew. The Gemara tells us, Tanu Rabbanim, our sages taught, Ma'aseh b'chosid echad, it would incident before a certain pious person, who was praying whilst traveling on his way. And a hegmon, a non-Jewish officer, passed by and greeted him. And the person was davening Shemona Esra, and he didn't answer. And so this Gentile officer waited till the person finished. When he finishes Amida, Amalei said to him, Reka, you empty-headed one, you bore. Is it not written in your Torah? Take care of utmost yourself, take utmost care and guard yourself diligently. And take good heed of yourself. When I greeted you, why didn't you return my greeting? If I would have chopped your head off, who would hold me accountable for your spilled blood because you refuse to acknowledge my basic courtesy? The Gemara goes on to give the answer he gave him, but interestingly, this is the locus classicus for this pasuk, to be used in the context of, as it were, looking after your health. In fact, what this hegemon, this non-Jewish officer, has done is he elided two verses which in their context are not talking about health. They're talking about the experience at Mount Sinai. The Pasuk in Devarim, Pasuk Tes says, Pasuk Perik Dala Pasuk Tes, Raki Shomalacha Ushmon Nafshecha Ma'od, that take heed of yourself, Pen Tishkach Advorim Asher Ru Einecha, and this you forget the things you saw on Mount Sinai. Ufen Yosef B'Uvacha Yimechayecha, that you may depart, they may depart from your heart all the days Asher Yom Shemad L'Chol V'nei Hashem B'Chol B'Chorim, the day before we stood before God at Mount Sinai. And then a few Pesukim later in Pasuk 15, you should take care of yourselves. You didn't see any image when God spoke to you Mount Sinai. You had that experience of revelation. And so in its original context, it's nothing to do with health. But nevertheless, this is how this person quotes it in his challenge to the Chassid who's davening. And the Rambam in Hilchos Roitzech U'Shmiras HaNefesh, he actually quotes these Pesukim one of these Pesukim as well. And the Rambam, in giving us an injunction to look after our health, he says, "V'chein kol michsha sheyesh lo sakonos nefashos." And similarly, any obstacle which is a risk to life, mitzvah lahasiro, it's a positive commandment to remove it, lishamim memenu, and to be careful about it. V'lizar b'dova yofa yofa, shenema v'nisham elecha u'shmo nafshecha. As the pasuk says, beware for yourself and guard your soul. And if he negates this and he violates this and doesn't remove it, he is violated a positive commandment and a negative commandment. Our sages forbade many things because they involve a threat to life. And when a person transgresses these and says, I don't care, I'll just endanger my own life. Why does this matter to others? And such a person should be given rabbinic lashes for his rebelliousness. Now, there is a debate amongst the Rishonim and Acharonim whether this mitzvah nishmatim l'shasechem is biblical or rabbinic, but nevertheless, the obligation is there, and society has a responsibility to ensure the appropriate regulations are in place. But even today, it's not, you can't even maintain that position. I'm only affecting myself and not anyone else. We live in such an interconnected world. And Chazal recognize this in the famous Midrash about being all in the same boat. A group of travelers are sitting in a boat upon the open waters. And one of them suddenly takes out a hand drill and begins to drill a hole under his seat. His fellows say to him, Mata Yosef, what are you doing? What's it to do with you? I'm only digging it under my own seat. The ship will sink and it will affect all of us. And so we're all literally in the same boat. And the point is made positively in Choshe Mishpat, in the Halacha Dibai from the Gemara in Bava Basra. If you live in a city, the rulers have the right and responsibility to legislate for the well-being of everyone, and you have to contribute. So as the Shulchan Aruch says, it's a merubim. The Bnei Ha'ir and those responsible for legislation in the community can enact legislation and be obligatory that we should all be part of the things that are required for the defense of the city. You got appropriate walls, etc. And there are more ads the chol tzorech for all the needs of the city. And Rav Osher Weissschliter, in Teshuvah, he wrote on, is it obligatory to have vaccinations? And he quotes this particular passage. The Nesivos extends it to other areas as well. And he says that, so in the present case, everyone is considered a partner when it comes to anything for the betterment of society or public necessity. Each person must contribute his equal share. And there's no difference between a financial obligation and the obligation to vaccinate. The same law applies to both. And so we all have a responsibility to be part of and act responsibly in a society in areas that are relating to our health. Now, the world in which we live is a world in which we find that we have to look after, and we mentioned in the Midrash at the beginning, in the best possible way. And spoiling a world from which we have benefited from is an act of disrespect and ingratitude to the Rabbeinu Shalom. It's put very graphically in the Gemara, which says, "Bira the shosa maile mine lo tashne bekala." Into the well from which you once drank water, do not throw clots. And this is the world from which we benefit from, and not to spoil it. And there's a telling incident in a Gemara in Baba Kama which says that a person shouldn't throw stones from his property into the public domain. An incident occurred concerning a certain individual, and he was taking stones that were in his field and throwing them into the public thoroughfare. And a certain pious person saw what he was doing. He said to him, "You lowlife, why are you throwing things from a property that's not yours into a property that is yours?" So the fellow said, "You're crazy." He says, "This is my field. I'm throwing it into the public domain. So what?" Whereas the guy said to him, "Why are you throwing stones from a place that's not yours into a place that is yours?" So as I say, the guy just mocked him. L'yomim, but sometime later, nitzrach limkos hadehu, the person's circumstances changed and he was forced to sell his field. And and he ended up walking on that same road, and he tripped over those stones. The stones that he himself had thrown some weeks previously into the street. I can see that pious man spoke well. Because our private property comes and goes. What you think is yours may end up in, your changed circumstances not being yours anymore. But the things that we share, the Rishus Harabim, is the collective property of us all, and you end up spoiling it for other people and for yourself as well. And so he ended up learning that lesson in a telling way, and it's a lesson that applies to all of us. The classic source, of course, of being cognizant of the needs of those who come after us is the story of Chonim HaMa'agil. You know the story. Yom Echad Hava Azabo Urcha. Yoni was going once along the way. And he sees a person who's planted a carob tree. Amalei, hi ad kama shonim toin. How long does this need for it to produce fruit? Amalei ad shivin shonim. It will take 70 years to produce fruit. Amalei, b'shita loch the chayis shivin shonim. Do you think you're going to live for 70 years to see the fruit from this tree? Amalei, I gavra almach b'charuva b'shtakachet ashkachite ki echad shali avosui shalchazeni alivroim. I came to this world and I found carob trees that were there for me. Just as my forefathers planted for me, so I'm planting this carob tree for my children as well. So we have a responsibility that the world in which we live is going to be there for our children as well. I found an interesting source that wants to suggest a sort of moral counterpart to the problem of antibiotic resistance. A Rav called Rab Shin Cohen in Bnei Brak offers the suggestion. It's a question, something to ponder about. He says, I wonder whether the problem of antibiotic resistance, the drugs that used to work for us and are now starting not to work anymore, is a counterpart to problems we see in other areas of society. The things that used to make us shock, that hurt us and which we were shocked by, now we are so desensitized to. And these things don't shock us anymore. And so many things have changed in the world around us that, the initial shock mechanisms are no longer effective. And he says, talks about the need to resensitize ourselves in our moral universe, as well as it were, resensitizing ourselves in the physical world in which we live. And so let's try and wrap our material up together. There are various steps that need to be taken. And in society at large, there needs to be coordination. In some countries, antibiotics can still be bought over the counter or via the internet. And of course, the WHO is doing all that it can, but countries need to, as the UK has done with its Antimicrobial Commission, to work together for better regulation of antibiotics and the availability. We need to fund new antibiotic research, and from the old golden age of the discovery of antibiotics has dried up. Relatively few are being discovered. We need many more antibiotics, and it costs $1 billion and about 20 years to produce a new antibiotic. We need to ensure that in animal, agriculture, and horticultural use, antibiotics are seriously regulated. There needs to be better funding and better research, and the Longitude Prize will contribute in that area. Whilst no one's yet won the £10 million prize, they've been given various discovery grants of £25,000 to promising research, and Israel, as well as laboratories in India, have been doing some very hopeful developments, and Mirz Hashem, this could lead to something. And we saw over COVID, when people get their minds to it and people feel a sense of urgency, amazing things can be produced in a relatively short time. But one has to recognize this is a slow growing pandemic, if not the same fast pandemic we experienced over COVID. And we will find that if nothing is done, the antibiotics that we've been so used to using will be denied for ailments that otherwise would be curable. So what do we as individuals need to do? Number one, hand washing. Before COVID, and I don't know what the statistics are since COVID, but before the pandemic, it was estimated that only 1 in 20 people washed their hands properly after using toilet facilities. There are millions of bacteria between the fingernails and the elbow, and if they're so easily being transferred. And so proper hand washing is a number one. Number two, not demanding antibiotics from the doctor. And parents feel that, my child has got a sore throat, got an infection, etc. I need an antibiotic. Don't educate yourself to realize that it could well just as easily be a viral infection. And if you get an antibiotic, you could be doing your kid more harm than good. Educate yourselves. There's a great resource called eBug. I'm involved with Northwestern Jewish Day School. I've sent the reference to our school that in our classes on health and science, they should make use. It's a great education resource at all key stage levels in educating kids in a fun way, and it's good to be used at home. Make sure you've got the information. You can join Antibiotic Research UK, a charity to tackle antibiotic resistance. Your contribution will help research in this area. And if you visit a country that's still using antibiotics in an indiscriminate way, just be careful with what you eat and what you're getting, because as I say, the last thing you want is to be able to be in a situation you're getting an antibiotic resistant infection. And so, friends, these are my thoughts that we should be physically healthy and spiritually healthy. Much of what I say may be well known to you all, but I think it's an achrayas that we should bring these items to our consciousness. They should put on our agenda. Mirz Hashem, the Rebbeinu Shalom should grant us long life, good health, be able to enjoy our family and friends in Gesundheit and Nachas Peace God for many years to come. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dan Binstock. Are you happy to open up to questions?
Sure, yes, wonderful.
So if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
It's a point of interest, not a question. It was a very, very interesting talk. Thank you very much. And I thought I'd just mentioned that my father-in-law, Zechrona Livracha, he was a medical student at St. Mary's in the 1920s, and they were all taken to traipse past Fleming's Petri dish to see this future miracle.
Yes.
And it's something he used to tell us about. So
yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a chance discovery on Fleming's part. Yes, yes. The sulfonamide drugs had been attempted to be discovered at the same time in Germany, and they thought they discovered it. And that there were other people working on the problem around the world. But as I say, Fleming it's a medical miracle that he discovered it, and we've enjoyed the benefits ever since.
And by the way, in Israel, they're still very much slower at giving antibiotics than here.
Absolutely.
Plus, when you go for a COVID test, you don't do it to yourself. Somebody digs around and does it to you. So
yeah, and the Israelis have got much more sophisticated tests. There's some spittle tests and I know saliva tests that we've not caught up with in this country.
Anyway, it was very interesting. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Anyone else want to ask something? We'll put it on the chat. Otherwise, we will round up. Thank you so much, Dayan Binstock. Really fascinating, excellent whirlwind tour of antibiotics, immunity, and so many sources of highlighting for us so many important and worrying areas and developments, especially with antibiotic resistance. So huge thanks.
My pleasure.
Our next share will be in 4 weeks' time. It's Shabbos, the 5th of February. Robertson Lauren Levine will be speaking, and we're still finalizing her title. Want to thank you all for joining this Israel Riley Close series of Shirim, and look forward to seeing you at our next share. And huge thanks again, Dayan Binstock.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.